How many of those who went to Moscow in 1929 survived the capture?
Less than 10, I think. Something like 6 or 5. Problem is, there is no exact list. And this is something I forgot to tell you too. It's funny. People in Moscow had very little idea about who of important Ukrainian writers was still alive. So they, for instance, sent a questionnaire before the trip asking Ivan Franko to answer questions. So, of course, and it was still possible back in 1929, whatever, 8, to make fun of them, to publish this whole thing in a Ukrainian journal saying they even had no clue that Franko is dead. But apparently the same kind of misunderstanding persisted. At least 2 writers mentioned that once they disembarked, some young man running around asked, "Is Lesya Ukrainka on this trip?" Of course, Lesya Ukrainka has been dead since 1913. And they loved this because it showed not only the ignorance, but also the fact that the Russian public did not know much about the Ukrainian culture. So we are not quite clear on the list. It differs slightly. For instance, the Moscow press ran profiles of several Ukrainian writers allegedly arriving in Moscow. One of them was Ivan Dniprovsky, the friend and, I think, relative of Mykhailo Kulish, a very interesting writer. But he didn't come, actually. But his profile was there, and so he was listed among the people. There were also members of the delegation who were not listed in official press, because they were officials. There was a chief censor of Ukraine who actually asked a provocative question of Stalin, which mind-boggling. The chief censor, but he is asking a Ukrainian patriotic question. What is this all about? There was the head of the administration of arts in Ukraine, actually asked, what about those ethnic Russians who do not live in the areas which we are hoping to unite? The other ones, can they be provided with literature and education? Really? So he's not on the list. There was, I don't know who he was at the time, he was a party chief of Donetsk in late 1930s, Führer, who actually was removed as a part of campaign against the foreign enemies. So there are party types and government types who are actually there, but not on the list. So we can only estimate that possibly around 52 people who the better survival rates are among the opera singers. But there's an exception. Mykhailo Donets was there, and he very famously got arrested very soon after World War II started, because we talked quite a bit about the arrests and executions that took place in Галичина, right? Once the Soviets were retreating. But actually there was also a campaign in Kyiv itself to arrest the suspicious types and execute them as soon as possible. One of them, infamously, was this very famous big name, Mykhailo Donets, a famous operatic singer. But overall, the highest survival rate is actually among Patorzynsky, Litvinenko, Volhemut. You know why? Because they fit best in this kind of little Russian musical drama with dances, which Stalin apparently loved. And of course, and Voroshilov presented Patorzynsky with his portrait framed and signature after the 1936 visit. To my dear friends, enjoying the wonderful Ukrainian music. So Voroshilov, kind of Stalinist military figure, presented himself as a patron of Ukrainian arts. He really loved this whole little Russian thing. Of course, he is from Donetsk, right? So he knows perfectly well this type of thinking of Ukrainian culture as a little Russian one. So they had the best survival rate. The theater directors, actually, the theater figures had the worst one. And I think only one film personality was around, that was Dovzhenko. But he was probably already feeling slightly apart from the Ukrainian delegation and thinking of relocating in Moscow too. So pretty low survival rate among them. But then again, you see Maxim Rylsky, the very, very big name, is of course under arrest in 1930, but during the decade of 1936, he comes to Moscow. He reinvents himself as a purveyor of classical, pleasant to listen to, simple Soviet poetry. Pavlo Tychyna is member of this delegation, he is the dandy. You took at any photographs taken of the Ukrainian delegation, kind of the best dressed is always Tychyna. But of course, Tychyna in the late 1920s, he is still, a modernist poet. He is going to rediscover himself very soon as a person who writes in a simple, accessible language for the workers. Partia vede. The party is leading us. That's a different Tychyna the entire generations of people are going to know. So those who did survive, they reinvented themselves. And the Ukrainian culture with it. Yes, please.
I was going to ask about Tychyna, but was Bazhan there?
No, I don't think so.
And
Pidmohylny? No. I think they left the kind of controversial types or potentially controversial types based on literary group affiliation. I would have to check my memory, really. But what was happening was that some Molodnyak, I think, so Ukrainian literary scene and cultural scene is still divided into groups which define themselves politically and socially, which are fighting each other. So, for instance, Molodnyak is very well represented, but avant-garde complains about getting only one representative there. But that one representative is, of course, Polishuk, who asks the most politically charged question of the evening about reuniting with Ukraine all these areas from Russia. So he's the only representative. So people, there are also struggles within the group which define who goes and who doesn't. Yeah, I should have brought the list of 52 with me to check. In fact, perhaps I even have it. But, and it is ironic too, right, that Bazhan is going to play. I remember, when I presented one of my previous topics, of course, by the time when Bazhan is a deputy head of the government and plays a very controversial and sometimes really dark role in Ukrainian cultural life, and some literary scholar from the US, that was Professor Hrabovich, I think, said, how could that be? I know him as a wonderful poet. Well, because he reinvented himself, right? He reinvented himself and ended up persecuting Dovzhenko and being a decision maker and doing all kinds of other things. Yeah, I wouldn't be able quickly to find my list here. Okay. And of course, one other thing I should have said. What is on Stalin's mind in 1929? The rationing was just introduced in Moscow for bread. It means difficulties in the countryside. It means Ukraine is going to be politically important very soon. There's straight connection straight to the famine here. So he is looking at Ukrainian writers and trying to figure out whether they're politically reliable, whether they can be used to mobilize the peasantry, to squeeze out the last, drop of food and deliver it all to Moscow. So this context is important. So Anne Applebaum in Red Famine, which I had the pleasure of reviewing for one British publication, actually, the Times Literary Supplement, she's completely right in that the history of the famine has to start with the revolution, and it has to involve this particular attacks on the intelligentsia. Sorry, yes, please.
Yes, I enjoyed your talk as well. I have one question about a minor aside that you made about Mykhailo Hrushvesky. You said that he confessed. I've never heard him accused of that before.
That's not an accusation.
How did he confess, and what's the documentation for that?
There is. In an interesting way, Mykhailo Hrushvesky, because he was basically moved from Ukraine to Moscow, figuring out probably that this way he could be either very close to the political police or removed from political influence on Ukrainian cultural life. So I wonder which of the two factors was more important. But of course, in Moscow, too, at that very time, the secret police is investigating members of the academy. They're going through the same process of breaking the independence of the academy, which is prominently represented in Serhy Yekleczykov's memoir in Ukraine, because basically the Communist Party is sending its own representatives, party chiefs, people who wrote some party treaties, whatever, to be elected as academicians. So, and the academicians are fighting back, but they're going to be crushed. But the same thing is going on in Moscow. So Hrushvesky, once he arrives in Moscow, suddenly becomes part of the case investigated by the Moscow secret police. They are going to arrest several academicians there, including rather big names from Russian history, working on medieval Russian history and such. And he ends up being swept into that investigation. It is known in Russian as akademicheskaya delo, the case of the academicians. And actually they are treated rather lightly in an interesting way. They're usually released, all of them immediately confess. Hrushvesky claims subsequently that he was sick. When he was arrested, he was a sick old man, and that's why he confessed. Because we know perfectly well the methods of investigation of Stalinist secret police. Basically, changing investigators continue questioning the arrested person with bright lamp into his or her face until he or she confesses. And that basically worked for most of the victims of Stalinism. They also used waterboarding as well, if not outright beating. So for an older man like Hrushvesky, he claims later on that was not true. His confession was extracted from him because he was a sick older person, and this method was used, denying him sleep.
And the only documentation for that is his memoir? Is that correct?
Oh no. I think all the documents on Hrushvesky have been published in Ukraine, and that is probably included in the kind of the last chapter, how he was removed from Ukraine and yet ended up being part of this akademicheskaya delo in Moscow. So these sources have been published because he's such a big name, right? There are still writers who perished in the purges and we don't know much about them. But in his case, it was relatively easy to publish all this information because back then in the 90s, there was a brief period when Moscow archivists were rather friendly to Ukrainians, which is no longer the case. Yeah. But it's not just him. Well, almost everybody confessed, as far as we know. Harry, please.
Thank you very much for your talk, Professor Yekelchyk. It's very interesting and informative, and brings to mind just how terrible science works, if we need reminding. Could you say something about the source of your information, how you got it, and where you got it?
Yeah. It was a very difficult chapter. I think it's going to be a chapter in a book eventually. It was actually a very difficult chapter to research. There is literally nothing in Kyiv in the archives or in Kharkiv. Only one brief notation in the protocols of the top secret Ukrainian Politburo meetings, and this notation tells us that the Ukrainian Politburo approved of the trip 2 weeks before it took place. And also that the trip was organized on the initiative of Moscow, the propaganda and agitation department in Moscow. That's about as much as we can extract from the Ukrainian archive. I was also reading through the entire archive of Volodymyr Sosiura. Fascinating, by the way. Rylsky's archive is the largest, but not as fascinating in Kyiv, and stumbled upon this wonderful kind of memoir he started writing, and then he started crossing out things about sandwiches and such. But a lot was published, some of it in diaspora. And there was a survivor whose name I should have brought up in my earlier part of the talk. That was Boris Antonenko Davidovich, who was still alive in the 1980s and who actually published in Suchasnist a brief but fascinating memoir of this trip. But what happens with all the people when they... I used to say that my grandma was a child in St. Petersburg when the Bolsheviks came to power. What does she remember about the Bolshevik Revolution? That the kids were not allowed to play outside, right? So once people start telling stories about the event and actually talking about this event to like-minded people, it becomes a story with its own kind of narrative thread. And the moments when you know you're going to elicit laughter and when you're going to elicit, tears from your audience. So it has lots of features of an exciting sketch, a story you would tell, right? So when compared to other sources, it looks like, oh, this is totally wrong. This is like the other way around. He was not there. That was not the person who asked this question. And it goes like that, right? Or they only told us on the same day, no. We know that we're meeting in the hotel lobby. So it's filled with all kinds of mistakes. It's totally restructured, but it actually delivers an interesting tenor of it, right? Because his interview appeared in Suchasnist. So he is free to say, he is a dissident writer at this point, he is free to say that Kaganovich wanted to speak to us in Ukrainian to make a point, but his Ukrainian was so terrible that I felt bad from the first moment as we walked in. And things like that. Then, immediately after the meeting, there was an attempt by several Ukrainian writers to publish as much as possible in the journals, and this is about the last year, maybe one of the two last years when you can in fact publish conflicting descriptions of something in the journals. But this is the occasion when they think by endorsing Bulgakov, maybe, if Stalin endorsed Bulgakov, maybe we can bring back Khvylyovy. And Khvylyovy apparently says, and this we can find in the memoirs, that's a really good speech by Stalin. It would be really nice to publish this speech by Stalin. Stalin doesn't publish this speech, but we have lots of impressions, comments, memoirs. It was very difficult to find some newspapers. On occasion, the only trace of newspaper surviving anywhere was actually in the archival file, and it was disintegrating. So it had to be put together and a picture taken of it. So it's rather elaborate. So you have to compare and contrast a number of accounts that are complex and sometimes conflicting too. And then we have this official stenogram, which was not the official minutes, which was not proofread ever, right? So it basically says the voice from the audience. But then the next voice from the audience says, oh, no, I don't want to talk about what Comrade Mykhytenko... Oh, okay, so that was Mykhytenko who asked the previous question, right? And then the stenographers, they get confused about the names quite a bit. Like somebody brings up Kvitka Osnovyanenko from the 19th century. The stenographer is thinking that this is Kvitko, the contemporary Jewish poet, right? And it's filled. But gradually, and of course, the most fascinating case of all comes when we can identify that it was Polishuk who asked about separating those areas of Russia. And you know how we can find out? It's in his case, in his actual file, in the SBU archives. Because during the investigation in 1933-34, Mykola Kulish, the playwright, confirms that it was Polishuk who actually asked this most terrible question of Comrade Stalin. And then Polishuk is asked, so we have it in Kulish's file and in Polishuk's file, and Polishuk is asked, so what did you mean when you asked Comrade Stalin in 1929 that parts of Kursk and Voronezh provinces should in fact be joined to Ukraine? And he goes into, it was acceptable at the time to discuss, we had border changes, I didn't mean that, and I wanted blah, 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 blah. And so in an interesting way, we are only able to identify in this particular case who the person was because he was arrested, imprisoned, and eventually died for that, right? Because Antonenko Davidovich gives you a totally different name. He's completely confused on that most scandalous episode. It's an interesting investigative work. It sometimes takes me beyond my, takes me too deep into these literary groups of the 1920s fighting each other and such. But it's a part of the story which needs to be told because, in my view, it's impossible to understand late Soviet culture without this last debate and the lessons derived from it. Because it will be in a totally different mode, a totally different discourse is going to take over. Yes, please. I think it was actually your neighbor who's the person who's behind you.
Yeah, I have a couple of questions and comments. Maybe I'll stand to predict better. The whole genre of Ukrainian writers being sent to the capital is very reminiscent of the Gogolian story, Christmas Eve, with Kudla.
Oh, yes.
And Catherine the Great. It's really, there is a link, imperial and Soviet there. Zaporozhye to the Lamb, of course, is interested not only because it's ethnographic, but because of its plot. Not only emasculates the Cossacks who are living under the protectorate of the Ottomans, but also the plot is, can we now go back under the merciful majesty of the Tsar? And that, of course, would have also played into this acceptance and popularity of this.
You're right.
Opera. The questions that I have are about Bulgakov, because you mentioned the play as White Guard, but has it been titled then as White Guard or
Dniprovsky?
There's a significant difference between the two. Now, the novel is an earlier work of Bulgakov, and it is more heavily autobiographic, and it's more complex in many ways, even though it does ideological things in a similar way. But in 29, so the play is already a simplification of what Bulgakov did in the Petrograd was not published in Soviet Union until, and in a very sort of bracketed form until Khrushchev's short-lived thaw, 60 something, right? The White Card was only published in excerpts in the 20s. In full, it was published in France, basically. It was not available. It was not published.
Well, Bulgakov describes in Teatralny Roman how he saw these issues of the journal in the hands of everybody as they were discussing his play. Teatralny Roman, right? Which is kind of one way of telling this. We'll debate it later on. No, you're right.
The novel is one thing.
Yeah.
It's not fully available to Soviet, to Ukrainian readers.
Yeah.
But whatever was in the novel got transformed into the play and in simplified ways. The main things are there. In the novel, for example, we don't see Skoropadsky, we don't see Petlura, but I think Petlura is one of the key elements that Stalin would have liked. Petlura is not just an enemy, it's like a myth. It's a word that means nothing, that it has bound to be erased from history, disappear like a koshmar, and that's what Bulgakov stresses in his novel, and of course then it goes into the play. But Petlura is one thing, it's the key word, that it's this strange mirage that derailed Ukraine, so to say, from the right path in the eyes of communist leadership. So it's dehumanization, mythologization of Petlura, and demonization of Petlura forces in the novel. Now, the play cannot do all these things, it does different things. But what is interesting in the novel, in the play, for example, Skoropadsky appears, and he's on the last in the last moment before he has to be evacuated by the Germans. And the comical part that in that exchange with Mykhailo, he's saying he's still doing his little shtick about speak Ukrainian, and as if so he's the Ukrainian actor. So, toward the end of the Ukrainization is going to be soon labeled nationalism and be over very soon. And in the play of Bulgakov, it's Skoropadsky who plays the role of Ukrainian actor, which makes it kind of absurdist and, of course, politically subversive. So it might be interesting. It's certainly imperative to compare the novel and the play and see what Bulgakov does there. And I'm sure you'll discover interesting nuances there. But another interesting element, both in the novel and in the play, to what extent the violence that goes on due to the revolution, to these changes of government, is linguistic. It's portrayed as this encroachment of this terrible language on the mindsets of those old-timers, cultured, Gentile, and so on. They're wonderful, and there's this horrible, the way they're reacting to it, invasion of that foreign. Of course, in the novel, it's more complex. Around Kyiv, there's Ukraine. There are peasants who are suffering under Germans, extractions of people, but the symbolic violence of language that comes from the rural areas to the cities occupied by the urban dwellers like Turbines is quite a significant element that, again, would have hurt Ukrainians. And another thing that is quite important, people like Sosiura, of course, Petlurites are fully demonized. In the novel, it's the Antichrist like march on Sophia Square. Well, Sosiura was there.
Not just him, Epic, lots of others.
Ukrainian writers had their experiences in Petlura army.
Yeah.
They knew what they were fighting for in
Dovzhenko as well. Okay, everybody.
They're in Turbine play or in the White Card portrayed as those savage sort of nearly caricature like beasts. So
yes.
These would be interesting sort of elements to understand.
Oh, very good comments, Terasa. Thank you very much. Should have talked to you about Zaporozhets long ago. That would go straight into my Slavic Review article about the reinvention of Ukrainian opera. But much of it is there, but not all. Yeah, just published on Petlura as well, actually. And I think the one issue back from East-West, the Journal of Ukrainian Studies, on Petlura in Soviet movies in the 1960s, but didn't go into that one. But yes, actually Stalin lacks the language. When he denounces Dovzhenko in 1943, he wants to call him something, but he doesn't know yet the term banderite. The term banderite was not yet invented, right, in Soviet discourse. So he actually calls him the Petlurite, which Dovzhenko said, "Oh my God, how did he find out?" Okay, yeah, I have this entire part of the story which I did not actually include about some of them, in fact. And Stalin probably knowing too that some of them were in fact in Petlura's army. And Bulgakov invents Petlura, he plays with the sound Petura. It's almost like an explosion of a shell. Actually, the entire revolution is for him almost like an explosion of a shell. And I used it in the beginning of one chapter of my history of the Ukrainian Revolution, because Bulgakov says that he was in Kyiv during the revolution and the city was taken by different forces 14 times exactly. So some people say 20, some say 10, but he knows exactly 14. But it all started with telegram from the parliamentarian Bublikov. This is how basically people found out about the Russian Revolution in the capitals, from Bublikov, who was appointed as a commissar of the provisional government in the railroads, and the only telegraph which was actually working was the railroad telegram. So the telegram from Bublikov was published in all newspapers. Nobody knew who Bublikov was. They started looking up, and Bulgakov says, "And once we found out who was Bublikov, it is as if a gigantic bomb exploded over the city of Kyiv, and it was never the same." So he's very his words. He's playing with words. Actually, I have to say that of course Kulish is also good at playing, not necessarily with words, but he has a lot of interesting ambiguities, and he's clearly connected. The entire part of the story which I completely did not use today was of course about the literary answer to Bulgakov, which was provided by Mykola Kulish, the Ukrainian playwright, the same one whose wallet was stolen. Right? For that reason, as they joked, but also for ideological ones, he included a satire of Bulgakov's play into Mina Mozhailo, I think, and subsequently wrote his own play about the Ukrainian Revolution, a Sonata Pathétique, which is a very interesting and kind of ambiguous, could not be staged in Ukraine, was briefly staged in Moscow and then shut down. But it's actually a very interesting artistic answer, Ukrainian one, and also modernist in interesting ways too. But that's that message from the 1920s, that there is always an ambiguity about what Ukrainian revolution was. So you cannot completely dismiss nationalists, because we too are in some way Ukrainian nationalists, except we are Bolsheviks, but we are embracing some of this agenda. So this message, which is ever present in Kulish, is a powerful way in the 1920s to send a response, a message to the Russian audience, not necessarily in the 1930s, of course. Yeah, the linguistic violence, symbolic violence, this chapter is already 10 pages long, and I really I only went through introductory jokes. It's already 10 pages long, so there have to be a limit. The University of Toronto Press is telling me. Yes, please.
You made a joke about Lesya Ukrainka. I'm really wondering whether there were any women along on that trip.
Oh, that's...
And their involvement within those literary circles, what the role was and how they were treated.
Well, the names that jumped at me were not those of the writers, but rather of musicians, actually, operatic singers. In particular, Litvinenko Volhemut was, you will force me with your questions to actually find that list and refresh it in my memory, but the immediate answer would be the overwhelming majority were men, right? Which is one way of commenting on what was officially part of the early Soviet culture, that is the liberation of women, the equality, and the possibilities for women, and what was the actual realities of life. Right? So the realities of life were very different from the Soviet discourse. Okay, I even know the number of this carriage on the train. That was number 3, but apparently very few people writing about it. Okay, so there are women from the operatic and musical world, 3 of them. And one of them is apparently even a composer or musical scholar, Oksana Kolodub, probably related to Levko Kolodub. So there are three of them from the operatic world, the musical world. Now on the list of writers, I don't actually see all that many. There are women appearing on the pictures, some of them, but that is actually the high official in Moscow who is a woman, in this particular case, Olga Kameneva. Let's see. No, that was really bad of them. And there were women, of course, in Ukrainian literature, and there were women who ended up, of course, living in the United States and touring Canada, who left interesting memoirs about this whole thing, who were part of the campaign. Dokia Humenna I have in mind, but she was not part of this delegation. It was still a profoundly patriarchal world for all these declarations of equality, as was the case in other spheres of life, really. Marta, please.
First, thank you very much. It was just a continuous question about sources. So, everything you could get is still from Ukraine. You couldn't get anything from Moscow.
Well, that's the problem, actually.
Sorry, and that you mentioned the official script, so that's, I guess, just was given to you because it didn't have any.
No, it was published. It was published actually before the Soviet Union collapsed. In the journal Theater. Well, I guess it looked a bit like a magazine, but it was actually a journal, right? And the touchstone there was Bulgakov. That's why they wanted to bring it up as kind of those, provincial country bumpkin Ukrainians arriving to denounce Bulgakov. So it was published in Theater, and it was subsequently published 3 times in various other sources. And at some point, one of those scholars in Moscow specializing on finding things and getting access to places where it's difficult for average researcher to work, Leonid Maximenko is the name. I think he was in Toronto for some time. Actually, maybe 2006 or so. He was here as a visiting scholar for some time. So he has somehow his way of getting into the archives. And so he ended up proposing this document to Harvard Ukrainian Studies, which Harvard Ukrainian Studies took and published with some minimalist commentary. And he got confused about a few things, and he didn't know about a few names and such. There are some minor things. But the text itself is reproduced in both Russian and English, in this case. And he has a reputation as a good archivist too, so we can rely on this particular text. You should also realize that this text is a typescript. It was prepared, it was a stenogram which at some point was considered for publication, right? So they typed it, but stopped short of editing it. So it's not like you're discovering an exciting document, which is probably, this script we have is probably from the late 1940s itself. But there are signs that it was not really touched, because Stalin embarrasses himself so many times that surely would have been edited out. And that's probably the reason why it was not included in the first place, because he seems confused about the Ukrainian language, the writers, all kinds of things. Getting into Muscovite archives now became extremely difficult, for scholars with Canadian passports in particular.
But sorry, just additional, I guess it's the law who says you can get there easily.
I would not expect too much, really, because we kind of have this, I have some books on Stalinism in general, a political system and such, and there was this expectation that once you get there, once you get into the most secret of all archives, there will be the truth there, which portrays Stalin really as cunning, devilish. He knew, he didn't believe in anything. But really what you find there is the exact same stuff which was published in newspapers. So it's the same type of discourse. They don't really differ. And so, like many people in the profession, I realized, that was our own mythology of the secret archive. So once you get into the most secret of secret archives, it's like overwhelmingly about building a country house for comrades from the highest leadership, or like delivering caviar for the reception of Ukrainian writers, or something like that. This is top secret. So, in a sense, a unity of discourse was achieved at that point. What you get in the newspaper, it sounds like, and it is in most cases, almost like what you get in the archive.
I have one more.
Sorry, I'm sorry.
Thank you for that interesting lecture. It feels like you took us on a trip with these people's philosophies, the cultural anthropology dimension, and I kind of sandwiches all of that.
But we came back.
I'm left wondering what the impact of this trip was. You mentioned when they came back, the writers got together and chatted about it. But they went on this trip, they met Stalin, who wasn't prepared. They came back, and
well, it looks to me like they didn't get the message, because we know now that the transition underway, and I think I didn't finish this thought actually when I was talking, that the transition underway was to mature Stalinism with the primacy of Russian culture, when everything Russian is by definition kind of more important than everything produced somewhere in the provinces by some ethnic groups. They didn't know that yet, right? They didn't know that Stalin is going to very soon redefine what is the chief danger to Soviet political system, whether it's the Russian great power chauvinism or minority nationalism in the borderlands. So it used to be the great power chauvinism. He's going to redefine it as the minority nationalism. I think they came back kind of confused and thinking, okay, so it looks like we achieved our aim because we pushed for this play to be banned, and it was banned, not immediately, but very soon. And it looks like we do have, our agenda is right and we can push for things. And they probably walked themselves into the corner very soon, because this is precise period when we don't know what Stalin thought. But there was somebody present there from the Russian side that was an editor of important Russian journal, and to my relief, really, Novy Mir recently published his diaries. So we got access through this Russian journal to his diary, and he says, the Ukrainians came. They're filled with nationalism. They totally don't get it. Like they completely fighting for Ukraine. So and that was probably the opinion of the Russian elites and very likely of party leadership, that they totally don't get it. There's signals of that. Stalin says like, you behave like guests here, which means like you came with some kind of demands that we are. And Kaganovich says, well, I knew that the Ukrainian writers had issues. And kind of it's now confirmed that they have issues. So there are ominous signals, which in retrospect seem to suggest certain things. But they came back, I think, encouraged. They came back encouraged, and of course, as soon as they came back, this whole SVO trial in Kharkiv started. And only once these people started saying, oh, this is wonderful that Yefremov is on trial, they were the next turn, right? 1933-34, they are going to be without open trial. Then 1937, it will go on. And of course, the party officials, actually, none of the party officials is going to survive either. Those administrators who went on the trip, all of them are going to be sooner or later executed as alleged Ukrainian nationalists, except for Kudla, who for some strange reason was proclaimed a Polish spy. Just for the fun of it, you know. Stalin did it sometimes. Like, it's too boring. I mean, you have 7 people and Polish, German. Let's insert one Japanese spy, just, you know, to have variety. They did it, really. Like, you have defendants and one of them is a Japanese spy just because it gives some diversity to the crowd. Okay, please.
Yes, I had a general question. You've discussed Stalin and the Ukrainians. Apparently he liked some kinds of Ukrainians and not other kinds of Ukrainians. A few years ago, Professor Graziosi from Italy was here and gave a talk about the famine. And he said, and it really struck me at the time, that Stalin didn't like Russians until 1941. Do you have any comment on that?
A friend of mine wrote a monograph on that, actually 2 major monographs on that. And he argues that the invention of that Russia basically, this is quite common argument, that the Russian Empire disintegrated at a point at which there was no modern Russian identity. So, and it was actually Stalin in the late 1930s who started inventing a modern Russian identity, and the consequences we are seeing now, right? And so it was invented in a Stalinist great power way. And I agree, actually. Russians Russians were, as people, were being promoted very slowly, starting in the early 1930s with this transition of greatest danger principle from minority nationalism, that now minority nationalism becomes the greatest danger, not the Russian great power chauvinism. Stalin goes through a variety of arguments. He is also editing the history of the Civil War, where he inserts sentences like, the Civil War proved that the Russian people were on our side. The Russian people, not the Russian proletariat, but in general, the Russian people. And he says it's because of foreign intervention. So he sends various signals until 1936, when for the first time we have the appearance of a new official concept of the great Russian people. The only group in the Soviet Union which can officially be called great is actually the Russian nation, starting 1936. Everybody else is a junior, brother, sister, whatever. Ukrainians very briefly claim the title of the great Ukrainian people between 1939 and 1943. Occasionally, there are references to the great Ukrainian people, because Russians are so great, they're somewhere in the stratosphere there. But we can also be a little bit great, right? But nobody else in the Soviet Union, only us and them. But we are really low, they're really high. So it didn't happen in 1941. It was unfolding throughout the 1930s as other things were unfolding in Stalinist culture. Social conservatism arrived when he... all kinds of the position of women, by the way, in the late 1930s, women are pushed back into the from the workforce back to the house, and divorces made difficult, abortions banned 1936, homosexuality criminalized, all kinds of things happening in the 1930s, which make Stalinism really consonant with imperial bourgeois modernity of the Victorian period and the early 20th century. So it's not like suddenly in 1941 Stalin wakes up and says, "Oh, I'm in trouble. I need to appeal to Russians." He has been doing this already, and probably not just him too, because there are people in the Russian Communist Party who are arguing against Ukrainian nationalism constantly, and this finds reflection in the debates in 1929 as well. So it's a longer process which has profound implications for what Russia is today. Roman, there was also a hand somewhere in that part of the room on the right towards the back, which I no longer see, in which case, Roman Sankos, please.
I'm interested in or curious about the process of selection of the participants in this delegation. Was there a call put out and people applied and there was a competition, or were it just it was the party or the political police who decided whom to invite? I'm curious why the police didn't invite, for example. Was there anybody else who was not in that?
Yeah.
Sole member of
yeah, and I actually thought that Dniprovsky would show up as well together with his buddy Kulish, yes. I couldn't find, there doesn't seem to be any archival evidence on that. But there are mentions of this inter-group dynamics in Ukraine when literary groups are competing to position themselves as true representatives of new Ukrainian literature, whatever it is. And they are also thinking towards Moscow as a place where the proletarian literature reigns supreme, which is not quite the case. In Moscow they have their own struggles, very notably between Kerzhentsov and Bulgakov and such. But they're also trying to, the activists of proletarian literature movement are trying to select the ones who would fit better into what their understanding is of what is going on in Moscow. But I have just argued that they actually are misled. They don't quite understand what is going on in Moscow. They're going to end up. So the process of selection is not clear to me. It's clear to me, however, that it happened on a very short notice. The previous year, Kerzhentsov came to Ukraine with a prominent Russian proletarian writer, and they talked about it, and they figured out that the Ukrainians are really upset. And apparently they apologized in camera during the meeting, like in that room, saying, "Oh, we are so sorry that there are so many great power chauvinists in Russia. We should really be seeing more of each other." And then somebody published in one of Ukrainian newspapers a notice about that, saying, well, they have apologized, but they did so in camera. It's in a closed room, but those chauvinists, they have the theaters, they have the newspapers, everything. And so there does appear to be some kind of struggle which translates into the most representative groups sending their people. But there are also people who cannot possibly go, like Khvelyovy cannot possibly go. And neoclassics get short shrift as well. But I think they don't quite realize what is happening. None of them sees the creation of the Union of Soviet Writers, really. None of them realizes that it's not going to be defined through the political struggle among these groups at all. They're still, and of course Kulish too, he becomes president of Vaplite at the moment when everybody knows that Vaplite is sick. Basically, that's your death ticket, right? The last president of Vaplite. It's going to be dissolved, and you will go down in history as the last person who was trying to defend this lost cause, which has been condemned by Stalin, Kaganovich, and the list goes on and on. Everybody condemned. Khvelyovism. And Kulish goes there because he is a major figure as a Ukrainian playwright. But what we are also forgetting is, of course, he is a committed communist too. Right? So he's a party type, and he is during the civil war in Russia. He participates in the Russian civil war over there, not just in Ukraine. He works immediately after the Ukrainian Revolution. He works as a military commandant of a district. Like he's part of the establishment, which of course is to say that so many of these people are part of the establishment. But he has a standing as a kind of person with a party ticket. And I think this is why he really goes. But also because they expect him possibly to kind of transform Vaplite or apologize on behalf of Vaplite or doing something else. But as everybody knows, he ends up kind of going down in flames with Vaplite, which is a principled stand, which is very good for him. But it's not clear to me on what grounds this election was made. And as I said, we don't even have the full final list. We only know who was active during the meeting and who published articles.
Would they all be party members, though?
No, not at all. No, that's not the period. I mean, that would be a requirement later on. But even, the moment comes when Tyczina and Maxim Rylsky have to become party members, but this moment comes during World War II. And then actually they fast forward them through quick procedure. I forgot which one of them says, but maybe I don't have two people to recommend me because the procedure is really complicated. They should know me for 5 years. I mean, I have to be a candidate of the party for whatever. And Khrushchev says, oh, forget it. I'm recommending you. Stalin is recommending you. Things like that. But this does not apply to the earlier period.
I think we are wearing our speaker out tonight, but join me in thanking him for a wonderful